You may. You absolutely.
Good evening, everyone.
Reserved for you.
My name is John Tiggs, and I'm the event coordinator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the McNally Robinson Booksellers is located here in Treaty 1 territory. That is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Brewstertown. We're very delighted to kick off 2024 with our first event of the year, and we have some good friends here tonight to launch their new book. So we'll be getting to that in just a moment. We would like to thank the publisher, of course, CMU Press, for publishing this book and giving us a reason to gather. And the book in question is, of course, Wonderwork, Selected Sonnets of Catharina Regina von Greiffenberg, which is ably translated by wonderful local poets Joanne Epp, Sally Ito, and Sarah Klassen. Regrettably, Joanne is ill this evening and cannot join us, so we send our very best wishes to her. We'll be having a few guest readers who will substitute for her this evening, and of course, we send our great affection and hopes for a very speedy healing. There will be some readings from the podium here tonight, which will be followed by a conversation that'll take place at the stools to my left. Oh, and if you have just arrived, please do feel free to sit down. There is an aisle right in the middle, so rest assured you won't have to push past anybody to sit comfortably. Following the discussion, there'll be an opportunity for all of you to ask questions. For the sake of everybody watching at home, to ensure we don't have to repeat the questions, I will circulate Donahue style with this handheld microphone. So if you do have a question for our panel, please just put up your hand and I'll walk slowly over to you with it. If you are watching online and have a question to put to the panel, please just write that question into the Q&A on YouTube and we'll put the question to them as time permits. Following the event, we'll move everybody over to the signing table, and then you'll be able to settle in and get copies of your book signed. But I'll have more thrilling notes on that part of the procedure at the end of the event. Now, an unusual poet from the Baroque period meets 21st century poet-translators in this exceptional book. Catharina Regina von Greiffenberg, which is a delightful name to say, intense devotional poems presented in the original German and matched with innovative and moving new English versions from Canadians Epp, Ito, and Klassen. This is astonishing metaphysical poetry, original, provocative, and reverent. Here to introduce the panel and kick off this evening, we have the publisher at CMU Press, Sue Sorensen. Sue is the editor of West of Eden, Essays on Canadian Prairie Literature, and author of The Caller, A Large Harmonium, and forthcoming in March from At Bay Press, the poetry collection, Acutely Life. Please join me in welcoming the doyen of Canadian Mennonite publishing and Dick Bogard, enthusiast extraordinaire, Sue Sorensen.
Everyone, and on behalf of CMU Press, thanks to McNally Robinson and to all of you for being here to welcome this very unusual and very lovely, if I do say so myself, brand new book, Wonderwork. John, of course, just read the promo copy that I wrote a couple of months ago, and I was about to read some version of it, so I will skip through and not say all the same things again. But I will say that I had not heard of Catharina Regina von Greiffenberg when Sally and Joanne and Sarah introduced me to her, and I became very taken with her, and it took no convincing at all for me to put on my publisher hat and say that I would like to publish the fruits of their loving labor, which they will tell you about, which happened over several years, and the pandemic intervened, and I think the pandemic made their very poetic and creative translation project from German into English even more meaningful. I will just say, you'll hear a little bit more about Greiffenberg, but some of her writing has been translated into English. She was born in 1633. She died in 1694, but certainly not all of it has been. I don't think she's very well known here in North America, although she does seem to have at least an academic knowledge in Europe, in Germany. I would, as John just said, I would class her as a metaphysical poet, rather like her near contemporary John Donne. who died just 2 years before she was born. I'll introduce the people who are involved this evening and then I'll get out of the way. But first I'd like to offer my thanks to the maker of the cover art. I don't know if she's here. Ruth, are you here? Ruth Enns is a fabric artist, and Sally and I saw some of her artworks at the art gallery on our campus at Canadian Mennonite University, MHC Gallery, and fell in love with it. And this is a detail of a work called very beautifully Thread of Hope. And I'm also grateful to the designer of this book, Jonathan Dick, with whom I've been working for a long time, and I hope to keep working with you till my dying day. Thanks, John. So the people who are involved tonight, we'll have lots of people popping up and down, so that should keep us awake. Catharina Regina von Greiffenberg was born in Austria, what we would now call Austria. Her family was Lutheran and was nobility. And she lived in a time of religious and political upheaval, and it was obviously difficult to be a person of faith relatively soon in the first century after the Reformation. She was very much a person of faith. It was even more difficult to be an educated woman or a poet, but nevertheless, she succeeded in publishing hundreds of lyric and epic poems, 250 sonnets, and several volumes of meditations, almost all of them on religious themes. She could read at least 6 languages. She studied science, law, history, and philosophy, as well as theology. So you'll hear more about her and how I believe Sally first came to sort of fall across her work. The poets this evening will be interviewed by Beryl Hornachuk, who's the editor of the recent anthology, which is also, I saw it, right there. Recently launched here, To Heaven's Rim, the Kingdom Poets Book of World Christian Poetry. Beryl is originally from Alberta and studied Ancient Near Eastern Studies at University of Toronto and then creative writing at University of Alberta. And he taught high school for a number of years and now mostly works as a caregiver for his children, and he and his family live in Selkirk. As John said, we have 3 poet translators for this unusual project, and Joanne Epp, who is sadly ill this evening, is probably watching us from home and coughing, so hello, Joanne. She has published 2 collections of her own poetry, Eigenheim and Cattail Skyline, and she also serves as one of the organists at St. Margaret's Anglican Church. Sarah Klassen is probably well known to many of you, beloved author of 8 books of poetry, 4 books of fiction, most recently The Russian Daughter, which CMU Press published. She probably has the best German of all the folks this evening, so we'll find out about that. And her next book will be a new and selected poems from CMU Press. Sally Ito, the 3rd poet translator, teaches creative writing at Canadian Mennonite University. She's published 4 books of poetry. She also writes fiction. And her interest in translation was involved at first with Japanese-English translation. And that includes, with a co-translator, the book Are You an Echo? The Lost Poetry of Misuzu Kaneko. And I will just tell you, maybe they will put their hands up in the air so you know who they are. The other folks who have offered to read a poem or 2 this evening to help out the poets. Paul Dick, my fellow English professor from CMU, and Ryan Rempel, spouse of Joanne Epp, who is ill. So now that we know everyone's identities, I will turn things over to, I believe, Sally first. So please welcome Sally Ito.
Thank you, everyone, for coming out this evening. I'm glad to see you all. And I would like to thank CMU Press for taking on this book, which is a real love for me. It was a wonderful experience working with these with my fellow co-translators and praising God alongside Catharina. So I'm going to read the titular poem of the book, Wonder Work of Incarnation. The wonder work of incarnation. The cup of life is fed on mother milk. The conqueror of the whole wide world lies in a narrow manger. The Lord of heaven gives himself to earth. The highest good descends to lowest misery. See the prime mover gently cradle rocked, from whom heaven itself receives order and purpose for its course. Shepherds, leave the heavens, go now to the stable. Have you ever heard of such amazing wonder work? Weakness has borne strength, and a star, the sun. So this book we arranged following the liturgical calendar, and there were some poems that we discovered as we were going through her sonnets on the new year. So I'm going to read, since it is January, I am going to read one of Catharina's New Year's poem. On Holy New Year's Day, the great comfort of Jesus' name. Jesus, be my only comfort, no matter what might be. If I have you, I have all things. Beloved Jesus Christ, you, my strength and power, indeed my very life. This year, let me be rooted in your grace, and let your great star counsel prove powerful indeed. Your grace, our faith, make all things possible. To you, all human might and craftiness are spider webs. Speak to my plea your powerful word, it will be done. My hope has bloomed so long. Provide this year fruits of good fortune and joy. What more can I desire when I possess this gift, your love-ignited blood? Is anything on earth so costly, sweet, and precious? Dear Jesus child, let me abide forever in your grace, no matter what in this whole world might come. Thank you, and I now pass the microphone to Paul Dick, my spouse, and he will read another New Year's poem.
On Christ's all-holy first shedding of blood and the sweetest name of Jesus. And at the end of 8 days when he was circumcised, he was called Jesus, the name given by the angel before he was conceived in the womb, Luke 2:21. Lovely morning glow drops crimson pearls of childhood, and soon the Jesus sun arises, in whom God's brightness mingles with love's warmth. His heart's grace streams from this salvation light. Redemption's vein of gold must flow, love melted. This wondrous child cries with desire and longing. Will the hour of healing ever come, when he at last pours out his blood, a blessing flood for all? Eternal Godhead wrapped in a little cloud, this child. Just as from a great distance the sun seems small enough to grasp, so he, as God, fills everything, yet will himself be cradled. Peace will have no peace until it stills all human misery, greed, and hate of God.
This first one that I'll read is a part of one of the most amazing sequences of poems in the book. You'll remember at the crucifixion, there are these wonders that occur. The temple veil rips, there's an earthquake, there's something to do with the clouds, I believe. And there's a series of poems that reflect on these events from the point of view of the material things that are happening. And so this one is from the point of view of the rocks splitting. Yes, even were we diamond, we would crack and break. With never before felt fear, a shock, a flash drives through me, and my hard armor cracks in two. The sound announces Christ's death to the world. He, the true rock whom the Romans pierce, brings heaven's honey, wonder wounds water, and fights for you, rock strong with death and devil, who take their fierce revenge against his innocence. What hard hearts must you mortals have? Were you sired by snakes? Suckled by tigers? In that case, we would incline to mercy. Shock reveals the alphabet of heartache, written in dread and haste. Ah, learn from me how the heart splits with love, remorse, sorrow, and thirst. This next one, if Joanne were here, she would have had something sensible to say about it. I don't actually. I'll just read it. Comfort from Christ's all-conquering ascension. Away, death and despair, away with all misfortune, defiance to the devil and all his hordes. I do not fear their might now, not one whit. They surge against me, great streams of deceit. When I, with trusting heart, look to my helper who sits at God's right hand, I laugh at danger. To him, my heart, its need and remedy are known. A rescue seeker, I send all my sighs to him. He guides, like streams of water, every heartbeat, restrains with just one word the strongest waves, allows, if it will serve, the waters fall, but will not let it overflow the plain. He makes the cloudy clear, salt water sweet, commands all providential power from his majestic seat. Then this one is the one I was going to read anyway, even if Joanne were here, and it is a reflection on the Eucharist, and she let me read it because it's my favorite. The love and wonder-rich supper of our Lord. He who made all food now lets himself be eaten. The one who made both tongue and mouth descends so low and enters human throats. He to whom the earth is dust sits upon the tongue. He who encircles the great round world enters our small mouths, visible and unseen. His spirit and body presence is our sure foundation. God, doubly with us, will surely not forget us. The immeasurable who assumed our flesh came to us truly in the bread and wine. Oh, miracle-rich treasure, endless mystery, I cannot fathom, but I can believe. My mouth receives you, my faith leaps with joy. The how I leave to you, it will deliver me.
I'm going to read two poems. First, I'm going to read the one that we chose to be first in our collection, and then the one that we chose to be last in our collection. And they sort of bookend the poems in between, and I think you'll see why. They both refer to the poet's calling as a writer, as a poet, and her intentions. So the first one is, we titled it Christian Plan and Purpose. O all, to whom in all things I submit, in everything I am, begin, think, write. I direct my game and goal to your high honor. Oh, let me strive toward your praise, the angel's purpose. Let only that which loves and lauds you live in me. Oh, give me fire and wit to carry out my duty. Deny me not the spirit surge, the winged flame. Turn fearlessness to fire, so I may ardently uplift you. I seek no honor of my own, nor do I deserve it. Should anyone see a spirit benefit here, I beg them in God's name, do not ascribe to me the goodness in my words. The Eternal One alone pours goodness into pen and spirit. All praise from me and anyone be his alone. It's kind of a manifesto of the poet of what she intends to do and a petition to the divine for assistance. The second one is also about her vocation as a poet, and she begins with a little more daring. I'm going to start out by reading this one in German so you get a kind of an idea what the German sounds like. Auf die unverhinderliche Art der edlen Dichtkunst. Trotz, dass man mir verwehrt, des Himmels milde Gaben, den unsichtbaren Strahl, die schallend Heimlichkeiten, das englische Menschenwerk, das in und nach der Zeit, wann alles aus wird sein, allein Bestand wird haben, das mit der Ewigkeit wird in die Wette traben. Die geistreich Wunderlust, der Dunkelung befreit, die Sonne in Mitternacht, die Strahlen von sich streut, die man weltunverwehrt in allem Stand kann haben. Dies einig ist mir frei, da ich sonst schier leibeigen aus Übermacht der Macht des Unglücks musste sein. Es will auch hier mein Geist in dieser Freiheit zeigen, was ich beginnen wird, empfahl ich mein allein, dass ich, o Gott, dein Ehr vor alles wird erheben. Gib Freiheit mir, so will ich ewigs Lob dir geben. And our translation of that, the unquenchable, noble art of poetry. Let no one dare deny me heaven's generous gifts, the invisible ray, resounding mystery, the angelic human art that in and after time, when all else is done, will alone remain and keep pace with eternity. Wit, wonder, and delight, set free from darkness, are like the sun at midnight, streaming rays of light, that all in every circumstance can freely savor. This gift alone is freely given me, who otherwise must be a slave to overwhelming might of purest misery. Here in this freedom, my spirit will prove all I endeavor serves this end alone. O God, your honor I will raise above all else. Grant me this freedom, and eternally I'll praise you.
Sally, I think you can hear them.
There you are. It's not mine now. So we're ready to go? Okay, so the first topic I wanted to bring up, Sally has quite a story about how she first discovered Catharina, and I wondered if you would share a little bit of that.
Yeah, I was I was at the Cornish Library, which is my local library, and they had a book sale table. And on that book sale table was an anthology of sacred poetry by women, and it was edited by Jane Hirschfield. And I was just flipping through the book, and I was particularly interested in the poets that were Christian. And I stumbled upon Catharina Regina von Greiffenberg in there. And I read the poetry. There was, I think, about maybe only 2 poems in there. And I was just really struck by that, by those poems. And I thought, wow, I need to get more of her. Like, where am I going to find more of her poetry? So that's how I stumbled on her.
And you discovered there isn't a lot of her poetry in English. I believe those 2 poems there were translated by a very distinguished translator, Michael Hamburger.
Yes.
But there's not a lot of other work out there. So, and then you started to share this with Joanne and Sarah. How did you go about that?
Yeah, I did go down the rabbit hole of searching up Mike Hamburger, actually, who is, as you say, a distinguished poet and translator from German to English. But there was nothing that he had further translated of hers. So I thought, okay, now I need to find somebody who knows German and can sort of do that kind of research on the internet in German and in the libraries in German. And so that's when I approached Sarah and Joanne.
Mm-hmm. And what attracted you to her poetry? I'll address that question to both of you.
Well, I think, for one thing, the language, German. Most of us who write poetry here write poetry in English and also read poetry in English. So here was another language. I happened to have learned German growing up. So here was a language that was not English, and I was able to read it. That attracted me. Besides that, I would say the poems were energetic. The language was fascinating, and I was intrigued in trying to figure out, could I read a German that went way back to the 17th century? And then also, I think her strong voice. She had a very strong, consistently strong voice that drew a person in, a reader in.
Mm-hmm. And Sally, what grabbed you about her work?
I think the fact that she was expressing her faith in another language, and I think languages have personalities, mm-hmm. and they do things in their world that are striking if you translate it into English. And one of the things I noticed with German is that German has this ability to compound. You can compound words, and then you can get some striking combinations with those compounds. And that's exactly what I was encountering with Catharina. Like, she, says wonderful things like words like wonder work. Jesus's blood is referred to as redemption sap, which I just love. It's just such an unusual turn of phrase. We would translate words like salvation seeker. Actually, salvation seeker to me seemed a little bit what you hear, but then we translated that to rescue seeker. And so all these kinds of really paradoxical phrases would show up in our translation, and it was just like kind of startling, right? Yeah. To experience that through translating another language.
And Sue mentioned before John Donne and then the metaphysical tradition. What are some of the other poets in English that might help people orient themselves to Catharina?
I would say definitely George Manley Hopkins.
Mm-hmm.
Something about him, I always thought of his poetry when I was reading her poetry.
I think there's certainly an extravagance to her work, and it can be a little, in our modern age where we're kind of used to the sort of minimalist poetry. There's something very different about her work, and I think Hopkins as well is someone who does that.
Yeah, there's a kind of ecstatic nature to her voice and the way she describes things. So, she would talk about God as the prime mover and, prime mover gently cradle rock. It's just like, wow, okay, there's lots of, that's just cosmic language, right? It's like rocking in the cradle,
Yeah.
So it was those kinds of contrasts that were just amazing. And Hopkins, yeah, to me, Hopkins' play with language, sprung rhythm, and that kind of quality also I felt with Catharina's work.
Mm-hmm. For sure. These are all sonnets. Could you comment on her use of the sonnet?
Yes, sonnets apparently came slowly to Germany, so I've read. There was a writer by the name of Martin Opitz, who he actually, or I should say, Catharina Regina von Greiffenberg was born just shortly before he died, so they didn't overlap. But he was the one who was credited with establishing a sort of a national German poetry. And he was a writer of the sonnet. The sonnet that came from Italy came from a very different language, a Romance language, I guess, and now here it was in Germany. And he promoted it, and he wrote in German, he wrote sonnets, and he laid down very strict rules for the sonnet in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
And people slowly started to take interest, and eventually the sonnet became very, very important in Germany. But I also read that his poetry, his sonnets, he stuck so closely to the rules that he had made that they lacked emotion.
Mm-hmm.
But there was, for instance, Andreas Greiffes, who wrote sonnets, and they were better able to convey emotion, and Fleming. And then there was Catharina,
Mm-hmm.
and she was really very close to the forefront of the sonnet movement.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm looking at the audience. I'm assuming that everybody studied sonnets when they were in junior high or high school, and know that there's 14 lines and a certain rhyme scheme. And so people tended to copy those rules that Opitz had set down, and not always with very good sonnets. But Catharina von Greiffenberg is credited with having done it quite well. And
mm-hmm. Well, I think we'll move to, I had a later question, but I think I'll bring it up now.
Sorry?
I had a later question, but I think I'll bring it up now. Why don't you guys talk a little bit about your translation process? These are not in rhyme. Sonnets are usually in rhyme, but your translations are not. And your translations are also not quite in strict meter, but they're you try and create some of the similar rhythms as well. So maybe you could talk a little bit about your translation process and the decisions that you made when bringing her over into English.
Well, we never intended to mimic the sonnet form exactly, because obviously German words that rhyme in her sonnets are not going to be translated into English words that rhyme with the same kind of rhyme scheme. So we were essentially translating for the meaning of the poem. But we were always cognizant of poetic devices like meter and like alliteration, like assonance, and we would always try to then take the words that we translated from the German into English and massage them in using the same kind of devices that were in the English. I'm not a very musical person, but Joanne and Sarah are, so, and we would, we would read out the lines and we would sort of say, well, that doesn't sound, seems a little bit clunky here, so let's add this word or take out this word. So we were always kind of listening and trying to make it still sound, rhythmical or have kind of this sort of on a more intuitive basis, so that kind of beat to it.
Yeah, yeah.
I think we felt an obligation toward von Greiffenberg, who is the poet, her work, but we also felt an obligation toward the people who might read the poems and try to make a translation that they would become interested in. I mentioned this Opitz, who was a man who followed strict rules, and I find it interesting that he was also a translator, and I found it interesting that he sort of vied with the poet that he was translating, vied with this poet. There's a competition. He saw this poet as both a model and as an adversary. I thought that was interesting. Why would that he would take that approach? But about the translation, you translate from Hebrew, for instance, you translate from Japanese. We were translating from English, and English and German have so many similarities. Take the title, Wonderwork. The German is Wunderwerk, right? There's alliteration in both the original and in the translation, except that the W, of course, is pronounced like a V in German. And there are so many of these, Wunderwerk, Wunderwelt, Wonderworld, Wonderword, or something like Honig, Herzenshonig, or something like that with the H. I think it's easier, I don't know, but I think that our job translating from English into German was probably a little easier than what you have done.
Yeah.
That's just a comment. As for other techniques, yeah, I think, I think we could have done translation had we decided, or rhyming had we decided to, but
Yeah.
That would have been a whole other exercise.
Yeah.
Would have been fun though, too.
yeah.
So one other thing that I wanted to bring up was you were both translating according to the church year, and Greiffenberg's poetry itself often follows the church year or follows the seasons.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to comment on the, for instance, it is quite unusual to have a poem on the Christ's circumcision.
Yeah, that was an unusual one. Like, I don't know of any poem about that, or I've ever been to a service dedicated to that or anything like that. So so that was quite unusual. But she is so focused on the life of Christ. So we would translate her with the understanding that her life, her poetry was about the life of Christ. And we would translate all those parts that she had translated, like Easter, and we would actually translate them at the time of those events. So, and often we were working on translations during Lent, for example, and we were working on translations during Easter and Advent. And so the book sort of just became a natural kind of organization around the church calendar, because that's the way we organized ourselves in doing the translations.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so your experience of the church year is more liturgical in your church, and I maybe grew up with less liturgical practices. But we certainly did celebrate. We celebrated Christmas, the Nativity, Easter, the Resurrection. We celebrated communion. And I looked at some of the poems of the church year, and I thought, I wonder if these poems written in the 17th century, if they would be, I mean, all churches use some poetry in worship service, whether they would fit into a modern communion service, for instance, or an Easter service. And I thought, yeah, they could, even though they were written in the 17th century. Yeah, I think the one thing that she didn't do was write about Advent. And I think, I don't know why that is the case, whether the Lutheran Church didn't observe Advent, but there are no Advent poems. But the rest of we sort of regretted that,
Yeah.
because we do observe Advent.
One other theme that I wanted to draw attention to is her focus in many of the poems on Christ's suffering. And that seems to be a theme of her life as well. Did you want to comment on that aspect of her work, and that aspect of her life and the relationship between
Her life and the relationship.
the relationship between the suffering of Christ in her work and her own? She was quite a melancholy person in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, it's remarkable that she wrote so many poems about the suffering of Christ. She begins with a birth of Christ and a little bit about his life, mainly his healing ministry, the miracles, because she liked miracles, I think. Not so much about his teaching or the parables, and then so much about the suffering. And it's in those poems about the suffering that she uses the word Jesus and Christ most often. How does that relate to her own life? Yes, she apparently, in some of her earlier poems, and these were poems we didn't choose to translate, she is very melancholy, and she speaks of her suffering. And it's been written about her that she was a melancholy, introverted person, almost to the point of being pathologically so. So why was she like that? And what is this to do with the suffering of Christ? I can't answer that question. But apparently, the one writer I read thought that her suffering as she was born into Austrian nobility. They had to leave Austria because of the counter-revolution. She had some bad experiences as a child, and this made her melancholy. So there is definitely suffering in her own life. She writes about it. It's in the original book, but we did not choose any of those poems because we were always focusing on the church year, on those poems. So I don't know if that answers your question at all, whether there is a relationship, whether because of her suffering, she was inclined to be compassionate in those poems.
Well, leading on to, and I think we'll make this the final question of the evening. The poems that you read, Sarah, she speaks very highly of her poetic vocation, and it seems like she really views that as kind of redeeming her life and giving her life and her suffering purpose. Do you want to comment on her very high sense of poetic vocation?
Yes, she did have a very high sense of poetic vocation, and she uses the word gift, and she almost seems to invoke a spirit. She knows this gift is very important to her, and she says she would be a slave if she couldn't do it. She needs to be free to exercise that gift. She recognizes that her vocation is a gift. It's been given her and she intends to use it for the glory of God and not for herself. And she's very strong in this. And she also, in the one poem I read, she sort of almost feels defensive that no one dare deny me this. It would be death to her not to be able to write. And she needs to write, and this gift is an obligation, but it's also, well, an artist has a compulsion to make art and wants to make art. And it also feels an obligation in most cases. And she felt that obligation very, very strongly, I felt, and set it out and the first poem I read is at the beginning of her published work, her larger published work, so that she sort of lays out, this is what I'm going to do. And she has many more poems about her vocation in that part of the book that we did not translate.
Well, anything to add, Sally? Or?
No, but it was quite refreshing to read of someone who was convicted that she had a gift and that she was to exercise this gift, and also that strangely that this gift, she would give her freedom to me, like, you know, because I feel today, if you're a poet, you don't think much about you're having a gift and your battle is with meaninglessness and despair. And, you know, like that's today's poet, right? Like, why should I even write a poem? Who's going to read it? You know, but it was just, you know, it was just kind of like, just to have her sense of conviction, but also humility about writing poetry. Oh, that's a bit, I found that kind of inspiring, actually.
Yeah, that humility, you're right, Sally, that's something we don't always have as writers.
Yeah.
Well, we're at 10 to the hour, and I think we'll wrap up our questions here. I do believe John is going to have some time for audience questions.
Yes, indeed. So I'll start the Q&A off with a note of gratitude from Joanne Epp, who says, thank you, all of you, for your beautiful readings of the poems. We also have a question from another beloved author, Dora Dueck, who asks, did you imagine these poems being published or a book happening when you started, or was it initially more just for fun?
I couldn't hear that.
Did you envision this as a book right from the beginning, or is this just for fun? Did it start off just being a fun thing, a hobby?
I mean, I was curious at first, and so I just thought, oh, I'm just gonna approach a couple of people, poets that know German, and that can help me sort of, you know, probe this curiosity. But as we started doing it more and more, I thought, oh, wait, you know, there's not much of her work out there that's translated into English, and we're making something, we're taking something old and turning it into language that's never been turned into. So there might be a book in this, you know. So, but we really didn't think it was going to become a book until we started to really work on it through the pandemic. Like, we worked on this book a lot during the pandemic, and really, I say in the book too, this working on Catharina during the pandemic really, it saved me. Like, you know, we're all isolated, and so, you know, like once a week or once every 2 weeks, we were calling each other, and we were translating a poem together, sometimes for hours. And then we would get this poem happily to our satisfaction, and then we would put it on the blog. And so there became a process of us doing the work, and we knew that the end of this process would naturally be a book.
Yeah, that's right, I think. And then at the end of that, we knew there were enough poems for a book, and we had this opportunity to go on a retreat, and that's when we put the manuscript together.
Wonderful. And we have another question online from Matthew. Matthew says, von Greiffenberg's Lutheranism came through especially clear in the poem on the Lord's Supper. Was there anything about the theology in her poetry that you found challenging or intriguing?
Well, sometimes her piety was over the top. Yes. But you know, then she'd come up with stuff like prime mover, and I was like, I describe sometimes how she speaks like it's a little bit like comic book language, right? It's like really hero Christ, and so, and sometimes that did feel a little, you know, much. But on the other hand, I also found that kind of refreshing.
I think she was pretty orthodox in her theology in accordance with the Lutheran Church and with many of our churches now. But yeah, this when she came to the poems of Christ's suffering and Christ's story, this idea of this closeness with Christ almost became romantically sentimental in an unpleasant way. Actually.
But I have to say, she was staunchly Lutheran. She was writing letters to the emperor to try and convince him to convert him, essentially, you know. Yeah. So she has a big, thick book of theological writings, yes, on which she has meditated long and hard on her Lutheranism, on her Protestantism. So
and which, yes, we haven't read, so we can't.
No, I read, yeah, I've read parts of it, and
you have read,
yes, and some of it is saying over the top, yeah, paradoxical language, yeah, for sure.
Are there any local questions from the audience here? Yes, sir.
I am curious about the collaboration process. So often writing and writing poetry is so solitary. And I realize, you know, translation is already a collaboration. But I'm wondering if you can say a little bit about what it was like working together on these poems.
What was it like to collaborate on a translation?
That was wonderful to collaborate, because as a poet, as writers, we work so very much alone, right? And Sally has already mentioned the pandemic, and how it gave stability to the weeks of pandemic. It was good. It was give and take, definitely, when we came together. Joanne came with her translation, I came with mine. Sally came ready to help us sort out which phrases were better, which were stronger. And there was a lot of give and take. Mm-hmm. I can't remember we actually got mad at each other or had a big quarrel about it. I don't think so. We were pretty civilized about it, I think. And it was good. And coming during the pandemic, as Sally has said, was a good thing. So I personally am not usually collaborative in my writing, but this was a very good experience for me.
Yeah, I have a quote here from William Gass, the translator, about translation is a process where the meaning is, by working through translation, you arrive at the meaning of the poem. And I think that's what was going on for us, is by discussing it, going back and forth over our own, our own translations, we would arrive at the meaning of the poem together. So it was kind of a little journey that we were on together.
And later, when we were on a retreat at the Neubergtal, we went over all those poems that we worked so hard on. I think every single one we worked hard over again.
Yes.
And every single one was revised and revised. So the revision is huge part of it.
Yeah, and it's kind of never ending, because actually not too long ago, I took my Google Translate phone. I took my phone and I went through some of the poems and I thought, oh, this is what Google translated this as. Interesting. So, you know, it is really a process of continually arriving at, you know, at a meaning. Yeah.
And were there any other questions from the audience? Oh, yes.
I'm just wondering if you're familiar with the poet Annette van Droste Hulshoff. She was Tennyson's contemporary, so much later than this one, but also a very spiritual poetry that I wondered when I was doing my master's thesis on this poet. I immediately saw the similarity to Tennyson, but I didn't know how I could prove that it was from the same literary period. And then I went to the library and I found a book of letters that this Annette van Droste Hulshoff wrote, that she said to her friend, I am amazed at how much my poetry is like this person Tennyson. Who is this person? I have my answer. It was amazing. So I could do the thesis from that one sentence. So yeah, it's nice when you have these wonderful aha moments, right?
Right, yeah.
Yeah. But I did not ever come across Greiffenberg in my MA or PhD studies.
Okay, so I don't know this poet that you have
Oh,
mentioned
she is way more famous than, I mean, more well known.
in German.
Yes, yeah, she's called one of the first women poets.
Of the 17th century?
Yes, of the Tennyson's.
Of the 19th century,
Yes,
because if
yes.
she's contemporary with Tennyson,
Yeah,
it would be 19th.
19th
So I will, Sarah, maybe Sarah knows this poet.
What was the name of the poem?
What was the name of the poet?
Annette van Droste Hulshoff.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah,
I'm
she's-
familiar with the name,
Yeah.
probably.
She's well known in Germany more.
I see.
Yeah.
Did you see any comment in her writing that might give indication the melancholy came because she was brilliant, scientific, she was exploring languages, and she was a woman?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Good. And so we're just at the top of the hour now, so I wondered if you folks had any closing comments you might like to make before we move on to the signing.
Closing comments? Do you have any closing comments?
No. I don't have any closing comments, but I'm very thankful to all of you who came out tonight to hear about this poet who I feel happy that we've kind of resurrected, and I hope she's up there somewhere saying, thank you.
Perfect. Well, yes, please do applaud, and I'll ask you to applaud again. So thank you all again for your attention and for all your questions this evening, both those of you here and those of you in the digital space. We'll now be moving along to the signing portion of the evening. So we'll be transporting Sally and Sarah over to the signing table, which is just beside our cash desk, and I invite you all over to join us there. Feel free to have a copy of Wonderwork signed before you pay for it. Just please do pay for the book before you leave. We have copies of the book available both at our cash desk and at the signing table. So wherever you go, there will be a copy of the book there for you. I'd like to once again thank Sue Sorensen and all at CMU Press for helping to make this book a reality. Of course, to our guest readers, Paul Dick and Ryan Epp as well. Thank you very much for coming on board tonight. Many greetings to Joanne, off in the distance. Thank you so much for your work on this volume. To Viral Hornacek for his inimitable hosting this evening. And please join me one more time in acknowledging, in absentia, Joanne Epp, Sarah Klassen, and Sally Ito. Have a wonderful night.